Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Dinah Foley. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a member of NYC DSA and on the organizing committee of the NYC DSA's Immigrant Justice Working Group. So this is the third session in our ongoing speaker series about continuing the political revolution, put on by NYC DSA and our local Afro-Socialists and Socialists of Color caucus. Last weekend, we hosted conversations about housing justice and canceling rent, where we heard from tenant organizers in Queens and Kansas City. We also heard from NYC-based activists involved in the movement for Black Lives, who discussed defunding the police, fighting for abolition, and the challenges that the political revolution poses to the identity politics of an entrenched Democratic Party leadership. You can watch both of these discussions on NYC DSA's YouTube page. So for many of us in the DSA, one of the best things to come out of the Sanders race was this new convergence of unions and movement groups. A coalition that included the Dream Defenders and the National Nurses United, Ethiopian packinghouse workers, and the tenant organizers from Kansas City, Miss Major, and the Sunrise Movement, among others. We'd like to build on this convergence by making it more formal and more durable for the long haul, and more capable of being retooled for non-electoral organizing work. And we also want to engender more comradely discussion around big strategic questions across organizations as well as within them. And so this discussion on fighting the right is one key part of that, as the events of the last few weeks have made abundantly clear. So before I get into the specifics of this panel, I wanted to encourage everyone watching to please check out the Facebook event and Eventbrite registration for not just this panel, but the whole speaker series. And if you throw your contact information into the Eventbrite below, you'll be able to receive more information and updates about the panels that'll be coming up in the next few weekends. This panel is organized around questions of how we understand and defeat the political right in this country. So for many of us, this presidential election is a key battle in defeating a xenophobic, authoritarian, and white supremacist right. But no matter the outcome of the election, and no matter what Trump does with the results, we know that they'll continue to be a force in all arenas of American life, in Congress and state houses, in police departments and border patrol, and in militias and think tanks. So with this in mind, this panel wants to ask how we supplement the ballot box with other grassroots organizing strategies for fighting a right-wing political project that wants to disorganize the working class and provide an institutional basis for reactionaries. So to discuss all of this and more, I'm joined by some really incredible organizers who are fighting against police power and borders. So first we have Brendan O'Connor, who is the author of Blood Red Line, forthcoming from Haymarket in 2020. Olivia Catley-Smith, co-chair of Portland DSA, and a member of DSA's National Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions and Palestinian Solidarity Working Groups. Naeem Islam, an immigrant rights organizer with Desi's Rising Up and Moving, Drum, and Eric Fritz from United Against Racism and Fascism in New York City. So it's wonderful to have you all here. And for those watching, as the conversation unfolds, please feel free to post your thoughts and questions in the chat below, and we'll try to get to them at the end. So to get things started, I'd like to hear from everyone about what fighting the right looks like day to day in your organizations. And let's just kick it off with Brendan, since you're first up on my screen.
Thanks, Dinah. Thanks everyone for being here and for pulling this panel and this series together. What does fighting the right look like on a day-to-day basis? Well, I think it takes a lot of different forms. I mean, some are more oblique than others, and I think actually the day-to-day fight against the political right looks less like direct confrontation and more like other kinds of organizing, whether it's labor organizing, tenant organizing, political education, both about the right itself and the threat that it poses and the way that it moves through the world, but then also about what the alternatives that we as socialists and communists want to present to people. A different story and a different kind of explanation for why suffering and exploitation and oppression exists. Because I think what we're seeing is that actually the the explanation that the right and the far right offers, unfortunately, really resonates with people, with a lot of people. Not everyone and not all kinds of people, but it's there. There is a base for it. So I think that while the kind of the spectacle of street violence and confrontations maybe takes up a lot of space in people's imagination about what fighting the right looks like, that is something that develops out of long, slow, ongoing struggles that then sometimes kind of boil over, depending on what, depending on where we find ourselves on the political terrain.
I can go. Yeah, so in Portland DSA, fighting the right has first and foremost sort of had to be reactive and about street confrontation. So the Portland chapter of DSA was founded in 2016, right after Trump got elected. So we were still just kind of like getting our feet under us when white supremacist Jeremy Christian stabbed 3 men on a MAX train and killed 2 of them. And that's like when our street response really started. So we started working in coalition with all these other groups on the left, while we had Joey Gibson and Patriot Prayer, as well as the 3%ers, Proud Boys, and a bunch of other like fringe groups and militias kept coming into town to terrorize us. So we've had to do street response in response to that. And, it's really become a sort of messed up tradition where we call it like fascist season. Like they have a very predictable pattern when they come, usually during the summer. So we show up and help organize these street protests, and also organize mutual aid to coincide with the street protests, which has only been more necessary as we have, wildfires and the protests against police violence and all these other crises that are happening with coronavirus. We're also partnering with groups like Rose City Antifa, who, have been doing this for a long time and are really experienced in like the research part of this, and, sort of go into like the identities of these groups and their members. DSA in Portland now has over 2,000 members. So the role we play in these street responses is turning out a few hundred people to these events, and also like popularizing being an anti-fascist. And what it means to be an anti-fascist, because we're out there, we're like visible in our DSA t-shirts. We're not anonymous, though, there's obviously a need for that kind of organizing as well. But we're out there also talking about all the other things we're working on. So universal preschool, organizing in workplaces, housing and tenants' rights, just like Brennan was talking about. We're working towards building the kind of society we want to create. And that's the deeper, like long-term work of fighting fascism. So beyond just responding in the streets to protect our communities physically, which we are forced to do in Portland, we have to root out fascism. And we know that fascism does not occur in a vacuum. It occurs because of capitalism. So that's our long-term fight.
Yeah, I agree with the previous 2 speakers. Although, if the question is what does fighting the right look like in your organization, my organization makes no claim we're central to fighting the right in general. I think that the speakers were correct. There are other areas, union organizing. You look at the movement for Black Lives, or protests against police racism and violence now are key aspects of this. There's the everyday working on the fight the right by building the left, by building working class power. But people do that in different ways. For UARF, we are concentrating specifically on fighting the far right, on some of the things that Olivia was talking about in Portland. It's not at that level in New York, but it's happening here too. And there's a growing danger of a substantial fascist movement. It's not to say that fighting the right, the system, loyal, the system itself is not a priority, but those things have to be distinguished and are effectively fought in different ways. And what we're trying to do is build an organization that can, when needed, mobilize against the far right with people of different politics. So we might not agree on some of the other ways you fight the right. You fight the right in general, but just that it's yes, fascism is comes out of capitalism, but you don't have to be an anti-capitalist to fight the fascists. And in fact, that can be a disastrous strategy if one limits it to one's own politics. So we're able to bring people with a lot of different politics together to do that, and trying to do that in an ongoing way, because that's worked very, very well in specific mobilizations. But in a time like this, I think we also need to do that in the longer term, get to trust each other and work with each other more.
Guess it's me. I'll start with a little bit about the organization I'm with, Drum, Daisy Rising Up and Moving. So Drum's a working class South Asian and Indo-Caribbean organization of we're a multi-generational organization, multinational organization. And for us, what fighting the right on the day-to-day looks like is what Eric just said. You fight the right by building the left, right? So for us, that hasn't really changed. What that looks like on the day-to-day is the base building of like reaching out to community members, bringing them into this fight, doing the leadership development, practicing the skills to hold ourselves and our community accountable, and to build the skills to be able to govern ourselves, right? And so what that's looked like for us in this in this pandemic period, at the beginning we kind of knew like, okay, this is going to be pretty bad, but not just like during the pandemic, but what will happen afterwards. We're seeing the kind of on the policy level attacks from the right. We're seeing attacks from like militia groups and right-wing extremists. But in order for us to be able to face all of these, we need to really like dig deep and build our power within our communities to be able to protect ourselves, right? So in this time, what that's looked like, we started this campaign called Protection and Safety Through Solidarity, really being able to test, we've been doing this work for 20 years, but how much can we really reach into our community to engage people that are not engaged in political work, who are struggling to pay rent, who don't have unemployment, who haven't received any kind of benefits or financial support. And in like the last 6 months, we've been able to get in touch with about 10,000 community members that were slowly engaging in political work and just like supporting them through whatever was needed. So for us, like that's kind of what building the left looks like, right? To be able to fight the right, building that community presence and the connections between our community members to be able to support each other.
Thank you all for those thoughtful and poignant responses. I want to turn to the question of the nature of the current strategies on the right. So on the left, we've had to walk a difficult line when talking about Trump the last few years. We have, on one hand, wanted to be clear-eyed about what's new or exceptional about the dangers posed by his politics and rhetoric, but we've also not wanted to treat him as an aberration, either from the radicalizing currents of the political right in this country or from the deportation, regression, policing, and war machines that he presides over and inherited from decades of violent neoliberal politics promoted by Democrats and Republicans. So what do you think is new and what's old with Trump? Like, how does that knowledge inform the organizing that you do? And what does it mean about the ongoing threats that we'll face after November?
Yeah, I can go. So I guess I'll start with the strategy question. I'm tempted to curse, but I won't. But it's very effective, right? Attacking us from all directions. It's very effective, especially those of us working on like the grassroots. We're constantly in this crisis management of trying to meet people's needs already due to the various different attacks. And so when you increase that and you're attacking from all directions, we're limited in how we're able to respond, right? And so I think we've seen in the last 3 years, 4 years, like how effective that has been. And also, I guess, like against the left or for left, like that's become so effective because of like how bad we are at coordinating with each other, right? Yeah, I'll pass to others if you wanna tackle those like 4 questions in that one question. So
Yeah, the explicit links between the Trump administration and the far right, the fascists and the right supremacists are new, are not something we've seen before, are more extreme. Although at the same time, and I, if I'm speaking for UARF, I have to say there's a lot of different points of view in UARF. Exactly where you fit a Trump into all this is a complicated thing. But I think it's important to say that Trump is part of a long tradition of the right wing of oppressive aspects of American capitalism, and it can be dangerous to then say that to call Trump a fascist, because in the way it gets the rest of the ruling class off the hook in the way. It's sort of the non-capitalist oppression that happens every day, but there is a moment now in which some of the a lot of these isolated groups and militias and the rest of it have somebody building for them in the White House. You saw, not even from Trump's presidency, but from his campaign, how it emboldened these groups, and made it easier to say things that would have been harder to say before. And a lot of these new groups came up and grew. But what was interesting is that one aspect of the far right that grew under Obama were the more undercover were the anti-government militias, rather than the alt-right that had its ties, both to Nazis and white supremacists and the administration that grew under Trump. And now you're seeing that coming out again. And I think if Trump wins the election somehow, through vote suppression and the electoral college and the rest of it, that's obviously going to continue to embolden these groups, and that's going to be dangerous. But if he loses, there's also a real danger of consolidation against the government then, of the way that they falsely conflate even the Democrats with the radical Marxists and the Black Lives Matter and the rest of it. They're not going to go away, and there's going to be a different focus depending on what happens with the election. But they're going to continue fighting either way.
I do think that one. This is a really crucial question, and one that, as Eric said, like there isn't really a definitive answer to, and I think it's going to take a long time for us to be able to disentangle all of the contradictory elements. But I think that one really important break, I think, that is useful to consider in terms of what's new about the Trump administration and the state's relationship to the far right, is specifically with respect to the immigration enforcement apparatus, and the machinery of deportation, which we know was highly a well-oiled machine under the Obama administration, under the Bush administration, under the Clinton administration, and is built on, as Dinah, you said earlier, decades of legislation and this kind of constant current of xenophobia and nativism that has existed in this country for a long time. But a crucial divergence, I think, between the Obama administration's deportation policies and Trump's is that while Obama was very good at deporting people, the Obama administration was also very good at keeping it out of public sight. And I mean public in kind of quotation marks. Like, obviously there were communities that were very aware of this happening, but it wasn't something that necessarily was breaking through into like the wider political consciousness in a way that it is now. And there's lots of reasons for why it is breaking through now. Part of that has to do with like liberal media and the incentives that exist there. But also, I think it's because the Trump administration and people within the administration are very deliberately making the violence of deportation into a spectacle, not only to spread fear and paralysis through the communities that are subject to deportation, and even if people who are not subject to deportation, people who are in mixed status family, like this is something that spreads through entire communities. But it's also a spectacle for the benefit of the Trump base, and to be able to kind of put on this show that we are enforcing the borders of nationhood and race in a way that is for your benefit, and kind of making that an inescapable and unignorable part of our politics, I think is new and different, and again, like you said, irrespective of who wins the election, like this is not something that can be hidden away again, the way that a Biden administration probably would like to, because they're not going to stop deporting people, but they're not going to be able to, like, I don't know. I'm maybe I'm being naive that people will stop caring, but I think that it's been made too unavoidable to hide it anymore. And so I think that is like a really important development, and will remain an extremely a radicalizing kind of contradiction on both the left and the right.
Yeah, I'll just say quickly, it's funny, I was having a conversation with my mom yesterday about our relatives in Ohio that support Trump, and she was like, well, they're in a small town, so like it's fine that they're conservative, but like how could they support Trump? I'm like, what do you mean it's fine that they're conservative, but just not Trump? Like, Trump is mask off. These are things that the right has always believed, and just, Trump has emboldened people to be more hateful and more violent, but these ideals were always deeply held. So I get annoyed when liberals focus just on Trump, as other people have pointed out. But I do think we can use that to our advantage in organizing all the time, because people are so viscerally disgusted with Trump. We can use that in responding to whatever happens in November. So just like we saw with the Women's March in 2016, I think millions of liberals are going to be activated in response to the election. And I think socialists are in a place right now where we were not in 2016, where we can really lead the fight on this in the streets now. We have built that base. We have built that reputation. People know who DSA is. And, I think we can lead the movement in the direction that it needs to go this time. The other thing I'll add is, like, because of this public spectacle, like you were talking about, Brendan, that the Trump regime is so good at doing, I think there's a new level of like a sense of conspiracy, and a new level of emboldened right-wing organizing on the ground. So like, again, going back to the wildfires that just happened here in Oregon, We had right-wing militias who were setting up checkpoints in towns outside of Portland. And they were saying, we have to keep Antifa out. Antifa is going to come in and loot. And the police were allowing them to do this. People would call the cops. It happened to my friend, my former co-chair, actually, of Portland DSA, her sister. She was at her boyfriend's house in rural Oregon, and there was a militia right outside their house, and they called the cops, and the cops came and just told them, like, here's what you can do, told the militia, like, here's what you can do to, like, not get arrested. Here's so you don't cross any lines that we have to come and, like, get you in trouble. They just let them do this. And the media, the local media in Portland runs with it and, like, interviews these people, gives them a platform. And people believe that Antifa was starting the fires. Like, I've seen it all over social media. And it's just, I don't think we were prepared for fighting this kind of, like, disinformation. That's another level that we're going to have to engage in.
Thank you all. That's so right. I mean, there is so much that is uniquely threatening about Trump and his policies, and particularly, as you mentioned, Brendan, his coordinated and aggressive and unveiled attacks on immigrant communities. But there's also a grave risk of returning to the policies and politics that engendered his rise once he's defeated. To focus for a minute more on Trump's tactics and the tactics that are currently being employed by the right more broadly, their strategy hits out in all directions. They've attacked Muslims and immigrants, Black people and anarchists, all with different degrees of vitriol, policy attacks, and consequence. And this is, in many ways, just a continuation of the right's long-standing tactic of diverting attention from the real sources of mass suffering, widening wealth inequality, state-sponsored violence and repression, austerity and deregulation, lack of universal rights like housing, education, and healthcare. In other words, from neoliberal capitalism. But with Trump, do you think there's a logic to what he and others on the right are currently doing? Is there a right-wing strategy of disorganization to pit different constituencies who may share common cause against one another? And how effective is it being, and how do we fight back? And can we start with you, Olivia?
Sure. I mean, I don't have a lot to say on this. I don't think it's anything new. It's their ideology. It's part of capitalism, which has always necessitated pitting people against each other. I mean, Democrats do it too with all the Bernie bro shit. And, just as they attack these different marginalized groups, they are also very good at co-opting these identities, just like liberals are. The Proud Boys have Enrique Tarrio, I think his name is, as their leader. There's a Muslims for Trump group. And I think, we fight back against all of that on the right and, the center with socialist organizing, with the recognition that all of our liberation is bound together. And, we don't just organize with empathy for other people's causes. It's because there's something in it for us too. Like, we will all benefit from living in a more just society.
Yeah, certainly from liberal quarters, you see that division as well about the good protesters and the bad protesters and the rest of that. And I think, that kind of divide and rule has always been happening. But I also think that Trump specifically is kind of remarkably self-serving about this and is not necessarily sharing a larger strategy of the right. And he wants, he's perfectly happy to try to rope in Biden. Part of his strategy is trying to say that Biden is part of all this far left, rioting in the streets and all. And there are other elements of the ruling class who are like, no, that's not what, that's not what we're trying to do. So that has its own dangers, but it also has ways that has things that we can work with those divisions and we can say we're going to do them.
Okay, I'm gonna move forward because over the next few questions, I want to turn to some questions and connections that part of the organized right has been inviting within the state and outside of the state. The first centers on events earlier this summer when Trump deployed members of U.S. Customs and Border Protection to police the movement for Black lives in big cities, but especially in Portland, Oregon. And Olivia, I'd love to hear from you specifically, but the questions are really for everyone. So Trump deployed them so that local police would have more force to quell demonstrations, but they often seem designed to score political points too, to demonize seemingly liberal mayors and
Yeah, sure. I know that she was talking about Trump sending in federal officers to respond to the protests in Portland earlier this summer. And, you know, part of the question was, is it fair to call this a right-wing strategy? And I think, of course, it's fair to call it a right-wing strategy. Obama did it too. You know, Obama deployed federal officers in Ferguson and Standing Rock and Baltimore, but Obama is not left-wing. So I would say, yes, it's a right-wing strategy. And yeah, we saw federal officers being deployed in response to the protests against police violence in Portland. They're still here. They're just kind of hiding and sort of wait until maybe protests come near federal property. But it was absolutely a political decision because the protests in Portland at the time were kind of dying down. You know, they were still happening every night, but it was a few hundred people as opposed to the thousands that were out at first. And then when the feds were sent in, you know, that brought back out, you know, tens of thousands of people. And, you know, it was a really interesting because it was, you know, an activation for us as well. Like we saw a huge labor contingent mobilized in response to the federal officers being here that, you know, that labor contingent was not involved in the protests before that happened. You know, and so of course Trump was using it to score political points to be like, I'm crushing Antifa and the anarchists, blah, blah, blah. But, you know, our mayor, Ted Wheeler, was also using it to score political points. You know, Ted Wheeler got to pretend to be the resistance to Trump, and he went out and got tear gassed by the feds for a photo op. And then, you know, he turns around and lets his police force gas us hundreds and hundreds of times throughout this whole summer. It was really frustrating to see that narrative play out and to see Ted Wheeler on MSNBC every day talking about how dare you, sir, because we're protesting him. Like we're out there in the first place to protest Ted Wheeler. Our whole city council and Ted Wheeler, they're all Democrats. They're the ones with the power to take away money and power from the police, which is what our demands are. They refuse to do it. The feds get sent in, and now suddenly they're the resistance. It's really frustrating to watch them score political points as well off of this. But it really shows how they're not on our side. Trump and the Democrats, those in power, are all on the same side. And it's up to us to carve out a movement against all of that.
Yeah. I have a question now. I mean, obviously, yes, it's a traditional law and order strategy that you see everybody use, and the Democratic and Republican mayors have done the same thing. Although Trump is obviously trying at the same time to blame Democratic mayors, to say that Democratic mayors aren't holding up their end of the thing just for his own electoral gain. But I think it seemed to me, tell me from Portland, but that backfired. And then maybe that was part of Trump's strategy. Okay, it backfired. There were more demonstrations, and he can, capitalize on the chaos because that's part of his strategy. But the vans full of all the different mix of federal officers pick people up, drive them around the corner, and let them go. Right? They didn't have it looked ominous. ominous at first, but they don't have the power of a fascist state. They weren't able to disappear people and throw people out of helicopters, right? And it seemed to me that part of it didn't work, and that maybe was behind a greater turn to the extra parliamentary right later, playing tag team with the police. The Trump retweeting the idea that Kyle Rittenhouse is a good example of why I decided to vote for Trump. Our federal troops can't do this. Let's work with the fascists more. What do you think of that?
I mean, do I think it backfired?
I think that's what happened. Yeah.
It's hard to say. I think it helped us organize more people against Trump, and I think now we have 10,000 people who know what it's like to get gassed and are not going to be. The first night we were out there, we had 10,000 people go down to the Justice Center, which is the police headquarters. And this was just the Portland police that did this, but they, fired flashbangs, and everyone immediately ran away. And now if that happened, no one would move because it's like, it's flashbangs. We have people who are becoming radicalized in the streets after facing this brutality. There was a report that came out just a few days ago that actually what the federal officers were using was not tear gas. It was like zinc chloride and something else, like some sort of chemical weapon. And we saw, people throwing up all over when this was happening. And, my husband got like a disgusting rash from it. And we're like, this does not seem like normal tear gas. And now we found out that it wasn't. And I think it's hard to step back and assess what actually happened and have some takeaways from that, because it's still happening. Like when we were, the fascists had a big say no to Marxism, Back the Boys in Blue protest 2 weekends ago, or 3 weekends ago it was. And because it was near the federal courthouse, DHS was out there. They're still here, and they're still being extremely brutal. And it's just hard. I think we're going to be figuring out the effects of what happened this summer for years after this, because it's still ongoing right now.
To speak a little bit on the immigration angle on this, so for Drum historically, whenever there's been pushes for comprehensive immigration reform, we know that it's always come with border enforcement, right? And historically, our membership has always been against any comprehensive immigration reform that comes with enforcement, in solidarity with Southern communities, right? In the past, I think for a lot of us not living along the border, compromising on border enforcement is very easy. But now we're really seeing all those things that we've compromised on being used to attack us in the interior, right? And not just on immigration enforcement with ICE and Border Patrol, but also with the military. Every time we've conceded on increased budget for enforcement, for immigration, or for police, or for the military, we're now seeing those things being turned against us for some people for the first time. For others, it's been an ongoing thing, right? And the thing that I want to really underscore, and folks have mentioned this before, this was done by both Democrats and Republicans, and we've seen that continue to happen even with Trump in office, with our Senate and Assembly leaders, right? And so while we fight back against these measures, I think it should be clear who built up these infrastructures in the first place, right? It was the ruling class from both the Democrats and the Republicans, or those serving the ruling class.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and I appreciate Olivia as well, kind of pointing out that it's hard to say whether or not any given tactic or strategy has been successful or a failure, because I think that we are looking at a process, like that there's an ongoing shift that is happening that I think over the course of this summer really made itself felt by a lot more people. And I guess I want to I will push back on one point with that, like, while I obviously agree that, you know, that liberals and conservatives and Democrats and Republicans are, you know, in ideological alignment, I don't think that, you know, that the state is like, the state is not a monolith, and that there are institutional actors within the state that have their own interests and material incentives, and law enforcement agencies have made it very clear over the course of this summer that they have come to understand themselves as like semi-autonomous political actors with their own project, their own, as I said, interests and incentives. And so while we understand somebody like Ted Wheeler, or here in New York, Bill de Blasio, to be, you know, what's a non-vulgar term I can use, to be a political opponent, that and you know, and to ultimately be on the same side as the cops. The cops don't necessarily see it that way. The cops have their own, you know, they've got their own things going on. and the surge in abolitionist ideas and the resistance to police brutality, the resistance to racial oppression, poses a threat to law enforcement's own interests, and they know that, and are responding accordingly, in a way that is, in some cases, disruptive to the overall capitalist project. And this is kind of what is, you know, this is like the seed in part of fascism, and like historically, is that it is something that grows out of capitalism, but is not necessarily, doesn't necessarily mean that, you know, it doesn't, it's like, it is an attempt to resolve some contradictions, but not necessarily in a way that is like beneficial for the ruling class as it is currently constituted. You know, there's people that might aspire to be, you know, to replace them. But all of that is to say that, like, these kinds of institutional alliances are shifting, and will continue to do so, I think, as these movements build and retrench and reset and continue to push for, you know, for our collective liberation.
If I could add one last point on that, I think it's worth also mentioning how the surveillance infrastructure that's been created by local law enforcement in cities, both Republican, liberal, neoliberal, how that is also being used by the law enforcement and by the right to target activists, organizers in our communities, right? In a way that's, like with many aspects of the Trump administration, not trying to hide anything.
Thank you all for those thorough responses. I'm sorry about freezing up last time. Thanks for jumping in anyways. To kind of piggyback off that last question, is the close collaboration of border cops and local cops also an opportunity for new kinds of solidarities for our side, for example, between the defund and prison and police abolition movements and the movement for immigrant rights? And how do we deepen these synergies and solidarities? What does it look like so far, and what are possible stumbling blocks, if any? Can we start with you, Naeem?
Sure. Yeah, so I think the first thing I want to say is pointing out that within the immigrant rights movement, we've seen a shift happen in the last 3 to 4 years. in the past, where a lot of the fight had been centered on citizenship or pathway to citizenship, or like, papers for immigrant communities. Now we're seeing a shift from that, away from just fighting for legalization and towards attacking the tools that are used to target immigrant communities, right? Like abolish ICE, defund Border Patrol so that they can't attack us. And so I think that's us learning, and that's us growing and shifting strategies to actually, like, shit, we've been trying to push for this legalization thing for like 20 years. It's not working. Let's try something different, right? And on the ICE and NYPD collaboration, so on that, we've seen even in New York, right? Like within our membership, a few years back, we had a community member who was detained in his driveway on his way to court to prove his innocence in a case that he was charged in. ICE arrested him in his driveway in front of his kids, his family. When the neighbors saw what was happening and they tried to intervene to try to stop the arrest from happening, ICE agents called NYPD, who then came and dispersed the community members, right? And so you'll see the NYPD and de Blasio and everyone saying like, oh, NYPD doesn't work for ICE, we don't support them. But we have concrete examples of when NYPD does support ICE. Or even kind of how our policing system is set up, right? If you can be ticketed for jumping the turnstile, not paying your subway fare, then you can be deported for that same thing, right? And so even when they're not directly collaborating, the systems are set up to feed into each other, to continue to criminalize and to cage our community members. And then I think the second thing I want to say is that around abolition, while particularly when it comes to ICE, we've been directly using the abolition term. I think it's policing less so. But I think while it's great that that demand has become so popular, I think as immigrant rights movement, we need to practice it better. So like last year, we were trying to fight the proposal to build 4 new jails in New York City, right? Close down Rikers and exchange build 4 new jails. In that fight, there was active effort to get more immigrant rights group involved. But at the end of it, there was really maybe 2 to 3 immigrant rights groups in New York City that was throwing down in that fight, right? Even though there were so many of these immigrant rights organizations who were saying abolish ICE, but when there was an actual abolition fight to be had to join and throw down, we weren't really there. And so really underscoring the importance when we talk about abolition, it can't just be for immigration, it can't just be for policing, it has to be all prisons, all jails, and all of these enforcement structures.
Yeah, I think we see these tactics on the ground at protests here this summer. We had CPB here kidnapping people in vans, the same thing they do to immigrants they're trying to deport. We saw them purposely gassing food and medical supplies and knifing water bottles. That's the same shit they do at the border. We saw just last week, there were huge protests at the border trying to stop them from continuing building this wall through indigenous land. And it's the same company, Elbit Systems, that maintains the apartheid wall in Israel. I think that it's anti-capitalist organizing is like the only way to connect all of these. I feel like we're so used to organizing in like issue-based silos. Like, I'm going to do Palestine stuff over here. You're going to do immigrant rights stuff over here. We're going to be at street protests here. And we need to do a better job of connecting it. And that's why I'm in DSA, because I think that, it's this big anti-capitalist umbrella that connects all these struggles.
Thank you so much, Olivia and Naeem. Those are really powerful responses. I'm going to move on to another question. Another equally alarming story from this summer has been the increasingly fatal instances of police collaboration with far-right groups like the Proud Boys, Patriot Prayer, Teenage Militiamen, and others. And we've heard stories like these throughout the Trump administration of collaboration between institutional actors and far-right groups. And just a few days ago, Trump encouraged the Proud Boys to stand back and stand by. Relatedly, cop unions across the country are making loud, vocal displays of their support for Trump. I want to hear from you all about why right-wing figures in the government and the state feel the need to turn to groups and actors like these, and how it fits into the right strategy currently. Eric, will you kick us off?
Well, first of all, it's not new. I mean, right? It was years ago that the emails came out about the Portland police talking to the Proud Boys, giving them tips on how not to get caught and arrested, tipping them off to an LGBTQ to the route of a march, etc. That they were very friendly and on the same page. Trump has talked about the fine patriots when there was the Patriot Prayer and the Proud Boys attacking a BLM protest, etc. It's not a some of these new things some of these new phrases are part of that history. So what is the why do they do that? Let me see what anyone has to say, and then I'll come back.
I hate the Bernie Trump comparisons, but I will do one right now. It's like how Bernie says he was going to be organizer in chief. I think that what Trump does is similar to that in a way that we have not seen traditionally from Republicans or Democrats. He inspires the base of the Republican Party. The Democrats don't do any organizing because they don't like that. They don't like when there's a movement behind any kind of politics, because they like whatever they pass to be super complicated, and they're the only ones who can understand it, and they're the only ones who can give it to people. But Trump comes from the media, like we were talking about. He knows it's his catchy sound bites and riling people up, build the wall, MAGA, lock her up. The right wing, I think, recognizes in a way that Democrats do not, that they need a movement on the streets to back them up. You can look at Blue Lives Matter, all these, the Proud Boys, the Tea Party was really kind of the start of that. But, obviously the right has all the money and the big capitalist support, which is going to get them more than their little movements are going to get them. But the Democrats have that too. The Democrats don't have a movement. For example, in Oregon, we were going to pass some stupid cap and trade climate change bill. And it had support from Democrats, big businesses and stuff. But this Timber Unity group was able to shut down the state capitol. There's a bunch of really conservative people who showed up to the state capitol with guns. And the Republican legislatures were able to flee the state, and they stayed with fascists in Idaho. This is the kind of organizing and collaboration between elected officials and these fringe groups that I don't think we've seen. Democrats don't know how to do that. And so I think it's really scary now when we see so much valorization now of Kyle Rittenhouse, and we're moving into uncharted territory, I think.
I think part of what is going on is the sort of like as I was talking about before, the sort of short-term self-interest of different groups and institutions sort of finding themselves in alignment and seeking out alliances with each other. But I think also over the long term, part of what's happening is the I think there's two important things to pay attention to. One being the dismantling, like the deterioration and dismantling of the of social programs, of any kind, of anything approaching a welfare state, like basically anything that like the government might do other than like crack people's skulls in one form or another. The deterioration, the systematic deterioration of the state by neoliberalism, in like kind of has reached a point where, in order to keep things going, the state then needs to like deputize people to keep this very rickety ship running. And that, I think, coincides with this second, even deeper process of maintaining the, maintaining this very delicate balance that we have in the United States between the interests of capital and the interests of like race and nationhood, and kind of being able to create a white supremacy, which is about like the creation of whiteness and a white race. And in order to like keep that project going, I think more that is a necessarily violent project, and in order to keep it going, more people need to be recruited into it, as it becomes increasingly tenuous, because there are demographic changes happening, and like that is real, and the far right and the fascists have a particular explanation and an interpretation of that, and part of our job, I think, is to is to say that like this isn't bad, actually. Like that this is that this is okay, like you're going to be okay. So I think that those are two kind of important factors that are underlying the increasing collaboration between state and non-state actors.
Two things I wanted to add. One, Brendan, what you just talked about around like the right-wing militia forces and the recruitment, right? They're organizing, just as we, for any mass-based organization or movement, we would recruit, we'd base build, we'd do leadership development, right? They're organizing, and the right wing has been organizing for a very long time. And in my opinion, in some ways, they've been out-organizing us, right? And so I think we have to be very clear that it's not just like, oh, they're just strategizing or they're just working together. They're organizing. That's what they're doing. And then the second thing, we should also be clear on the neoliberal policies that have created fertile organizing conditions for the right wing, right? This didn't just happen in a vacuum. There were things that were done by Republicans, by Democrats, that have created the conditions for them to be able to organize and mobilize and recruit in the way in which they've done.
Thank you all. And now that we've heard more about the role that these fascists... Oh, Eric, please, go ahead.
Just come back. I mean, yeah, I think that they're organizing like we're organizing, but I think one big difference is that fascists cannot be honest about how they're organizing. They're never straightforward about what they do. Fascists have traditionally used both, Hitler got millions of votes, but he was never elected in. He also had, 350,000 stormtroopers, but they didn't actually defeat the state. He was invited in. On the strength of stormtroopers and the popular support, he was invited into the government. And I think the people on the far right are looking to those connections. I mean, if you look at the far right in Europe, so many of those far-right organizations have dropped or covering up their kind of Nazi past and trying to look like anti-immigrant conservatives. But in this country, we don't have those viable third parties. And hence, that's why you see that strange connection. So this is looking at it backwards, not while the Republicans are looking at them, but while they're looking at the Republicans. They've been beaten back when they've come out openly as fascists, and they're working as we're supporting Trump as a way of being able, giving them the space to build with I think, but that shouldn't confuse us that they still have that idea in the back of their heads. I do think also, the popularity of defund the police, of the movement for Black Lives, the 60% of Americans saying, yeah, they had some reason to burn down the police station in Portland. That has led to a kind of a panic in the police, and like, look, there's this movement in the street, and people know that those movements mean something, so they have to create. That's why they're looking for, where do we get that kind of a movement from? It's not, we can't just fight it from within the traditional state. I think that's why they're looking back that way. I think the danger then, I mean, if you look in April, the militia involvement in the protest for reopening, against the COVID measures, et cetera, the amount of institutional and corporate support for those things, you see a beginning of people say, look, we want the economy to open up, and we need that movement out there in order for that to happen. If that spills over to also be about the environment, green priorities, et cetera, or if we take the socialist vision forward and there's an increase in working class struggle, the need to break up those picket lines, I think that's the dangers that could be extended. And they will look to that more if the right wing now is successful in beating Black Lives Matter, then they'll look for him in beating back these other movements. And that's why we need to stop, although there's a bigger project we need to be involved in, we have to stop that from happening right now.
Thanks, Eric. So now that we've discussed some of the roles that these far-right groups serve in the broader strategy of the right, I want to move on to what strategies have been effective in pushing back against these racist gangs. Is there a risk of being distracted by their antics and missing the larger institutional story? Or is curtailing their power also an important part of our larger goals? And I'm going to kick it to you first, Olivia, since you're right there in the belly of the beast.
Yeah, I think just from a tactical perspective, they purposely try to distract us with their antics. We see again and again when they come here, they'll announce a location, then they'll change the location. They'll spread rumors about where they're going to be and what they're going to do, just to kind of throw us off and see if we change our plans and, weaken our response. It's very intentional that they do this. I think it's also interesting to consider that the rally they had last weekend, they were saying they were going to have 20,000 people there. In reality, they had a couple hundred. It was a pretty successful day for us, until we realized that it resulted in the federal deputization of the Portland police for the entire year. So we have 50 police officers now who are under federal control. If you get arrested by them at protests, you will face federal charges. They did that. Our elected officials did that in response to the Proud Boys being here. But now it's going to last for the rest of the year. You know, that's a victory for the Proud Boys. And whether or not that was intentional on their part, that's what happened. So I think we do need to think about the larger ramifications of their showing up here. I think, you know, we saw some really successful responses in other cities where they had 40,000 people come out in response to their little rallies, and, you know, it was embarrassing for them, and they stopped showing up. That's not the case in Portland when we have 1,000, 2,000 people show up to protest them, but we have our elected officials actively discouraging people from showing up and allowing the police force to brutalize us and protect them. That encourages them. I think the only way we can confront them in the streets and get them to not show up again is if we have 20,000, 30,000, 40,000 people show up. And it would be really easy to do that if we had elected officials who helped us with that, instead of, you know, last summer our mayor called this big coalition of faith and labor, and they had an alternative event a few days before the fascists came, and they used that event to say, don't go to the one on Saturday. If they had just used that platform and that power to turn out all of these people to the actual event, they wouldn't have come back. But they didn't do that. And so now we're faced with the small numbers that we have, trying to figure out how to respond to them in the streets. Because, you know, people will say, well, if you don't show up, you know, ignore them, they'll go away. They won't get the attention they want. And we know that's not true. They'd come here, and if there's no one there to like confront them, they will just drive around in neighborhoods and assault people they see on the street. They've done it before. So we have to show up physically to defend our city. But, you know, it would be a lot better if we had a lot higher numbers to ensure they don't come back.
I think that's absolutely key. I mean, just a few weeks ago, Philadelphia was the same thing. You know, they said they were going to be in a park, and then they ended up with a surprise rally, the Proud Boys, through downtown Philly, with 50 of them, with some well-known real Nazis in their midst as well. And we did the same thing in New York when. First of all, the Proud Boys with Enrico, they tried to bill their rally as you know, Hispanics for Trump, and again trying to use this. Oh well, you know, it would look, the optics would be bad if you were demonstrating against Hispanics. But you know, we were able to cut through this, and so even the local right-wing press was calling it a Proud Boys rally, not a Hispanics for Trump rally, because we showed who was behind it, and we had thousands of people out there for their. And even just the threat, that this idea that we were organizing meant that their turnout was pitifully small, and we, you know, embarrassed them. We, you know, kept them from looking proud and growing. But although the left existing coalitions are enough for those kind of rallies, those little Proud Boy rallies, I agree. We need to be much bigger. The Patriot movement has shown now that they can bring thousands of people out onto the streets, and we need to be much bigger. We need to, you know, Boston, you know, when they had those huge rallies against them, that was very soon after Charlottesville, and it was easy to do, and that was very successful, but it didn't lead to an ongoing coalition among the people who work together to create that big turnout. And I think that's what we need. We need to be building out of each of these successful but smaller things we do. When we have a couple thousand, they have a couple hundred. We need to keep that going and build it to build those organizations on, you know, with a broad range of people in order to stop them. And I don't think that this is a distraction. I think it's absolutely key is demoralizing them now while they're building. Mm-hmm.
You're both so right. And speaking of the larger ramifications of far-right groups, one big question on a lot of our minds is this. Trump may not step down in November. He may not abide by the election results. He's said as much, and he might be aided by anti-democratic forces all throughout the American system. So how do we prepare for such a scenario? How should we as movements respond? And are your members or co-organizers concerned about this? And if so, what are they doing to prepare? Can we hear from you first, Naeem?
Sure, yeah. Oh boy. In terms of, I guess, like stealing of the election or whatever that transition of power looks like, I think I don't think there's much we can do in advance to prevent anything. I think what we can do is get our people ready to mobilize in masses as soon as they do some shit, right? Like, so whatever that looks like for each of our organizations or our communities, like really talking to people. So what that has looked like for us, going back to 2016, myself, community I work with, like so many others, we were really caught off guard, right? We hadn't planned for Trump winning. And so learning from that lesson, this past month, what we've been doing at Drum has been talking to our membership about what the possible outcomes for this election could be and what this means, right? If Biden is in power, if Trump's in power, or if Biden wins but Trump stays in power, what does this actually mean for us? Those are conversations that we need to be having with our folks, not to scare anyone, not for any other reason, but to really just be prepared if something happens. And I think one of the important things on this is really being able to envision what organizing looks like in each of these different circumstances, right? No matter who wins, we still have to organize. That much we're clear on. Whether it's Trump, Biden, or whoever, our communities will have to continue to organize. Our communities are going to have to continue to fight. But the time, place, and conditions might look very different under these three scenarios. And so, we don't have a whole lot of time. We got a month to be able to have these conversations with our communities on what winning conditions might look like in these three different conditions, what our organizing, what our base building looks like locally, state level, or nationally.
As an organizer, I do agree that it behooves us to prepare for every possibility. As a journalist, I guess I have to say, we don't know if he's even going to make it to November, and more seriously, like, Trump is at bottom, like, extremely lazy and a coward, and I don't think that I honestly don't think that he will. I don't think he's going to go to the mattresses to stay in the White House when he probably doesn't really want to be president anyway, and would be able to advance, like, to the extent that he has a authentic political project, would be better positioned within the kind of far right grievance culture to advance it outside of the responsibilities of the White House, to return to the media that he is obviously very much a creature of, which is not to say that possibility doesn't require its own organizational response from the left. I guess I'm sort of skeptical of the not to be dismissive, but like liberal panic about the possibility that he's just gonna like not leave. I guess it's 2020 and anything is possible, but I don't know if I think that that's like the most likely outcome. because like I said, like ultimately, like we have to remember that Trump is not, Trump is out for Trump, and I think that he's gonna take the path of least resistance. I don't think he really cares about about holding on to power in quite the same way that other actors might. So that's just take that with a grain of salt.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that about Trump. I mean, Trump doesn't have the backing of the military or the big bourgeoisie to have a coup. It's not like he could say, "Oh, I'm staying here," and he could stay. And that kind of, I should say that neither is his base anywhere near strong enough to to do that. But they can create havoc. They can terrorize. They can kill a lot of people if they wanted to. They quickly lose if they wanted to take power, but it could be really damaging. And yeah, Trump might be further able to further the right outside of the White House than in. But one of the big helps to him in doing that is a narrative of the stolen election, right? And that this government that's there now is illegitimate. And so that's, I think we have to be very careful not to line up with Biden and saying, we're supporters of the status quo here, but also to fight back against this idea that this was the radical left that stole an election. And I think the more people are out on the streets before and afterwards, the more it undercuts that idea. And it's not so much Trump, but the right wing that's allied with him that is the danger. And that we need to be able to stand up to them and also work with the liberals who are Biden supporters who are going to be out there. I mean, that's going to be the mass, there's this transition integrity project and all that. And that's kind of, there's a problem with that in that it ties the opposition to Trump to our our great democratic norms and the Biden campaign, but it's also something that's going to be bringing people out in the street, and we need to bring in other voices to those demonstrations. And that's one thing we're talking about in UARF, beyond November 3rd, a kind of campaign, and then we want to work with whoever else is sort of interested in that kind of mobilization here in New York.
I haven't heard that view really on the left before, that you don't think Trump is gonna try and do a power grab and stay in office. Very much, I mean, maybe we're just like so deep in it in Portland, but I don't think anyone sees there like not being a crisis come election day. And I think, we are planning for that. So like I said, in Portland, thanks to what's happened all summer, we have thousands of people who are ready and know what it feels like to get gassed and get the shit beaten out of them by the cops. And, we're ready to make sure that the movement in response to the elections does not turn into another women's march. And it's not, like you said, just making, we're going to make Biden president and then it's all good. I think, if we have tens of thousands of people out there, like I expect, the local police are not going to be able to do much. So they'll have to call in the military, federal officers, the National Guard, which will make people even more mad and bring even more people out to the streets. And I think, one of the ideas that we're talking about right now is pushing demands around democracy specifically. People are coming to this understanding, with Ruth Bader Ginsburg dying, like, oh, the Supreme Court is like kind of fucked up. People are understanding that the US is not a democracy. So we can push like radical demands around that, like getting rid of the Electoral College, getting rid of the Senate, some kind of reform to the voting system so it's not two-party domination. One of the ideas I'm excited about if this happens is going to the city council and asking them to pass a resolution saying that they don't recognize Trump as president, and going to the state legislature, having them pass a resolution to do the same, and replicating that in lots of cities and states, and then, see what happens from there. But we're kind of planning out these steps, both in the streets and what comes next out of that. Should there be a crisis around the election and the legitimacy of the election.
Thanks, Olivia, and I really hope you're right, Brendan. So this conversation has been so fruitful and instructive, and we're almost out of time, but we have 3 more really fantastic questions. So I'm going to kind of throw them all at you in a hybrid 3-part question, and feel free to answer one part of it, all of it, whatever you feel called to do. And if you have any parting words of wisdom or hope or wrap-up comments, please feel free to go for it. So this last question is about the balance of forces in this country and how we often end up being on the defensive when it comes to the right, stopping them from executing a new policy or taking their project another step further. And what does going on the offensive look like in the coming years? And what opportunities does our side have for winning? And in doing this, what are the most urgent next steps for unity on the left to fight the right? And finally, what kind of balance, if any, do you think we need to strike between struggling alongside liberals in these fights and pointing out the ways in which they've enabled or ignored the right's agenda over the years, and how there may be a risk of them doing so again in the future? So I will start with you, Brendan, if you're ready for it.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, there's a lot. I guess I'll also say, I guess what I was trying to say before is that I absolutely believe that we are in, a moment of kind of cascading crises. I just happen to think that given what we know about Trump as an individual, I think these cascading crises are not like personality driven. Like, they're driven by historical and material forces, and so like the shape that it takes, I don't know. I guess I'm just not totally sold that he's gonna do a coup. All of that having been said, what going on the offensive and what winning looks like for the left right now, I think Olivia, the campaigns that you referred to sound really interesting, and compelling. But I think it would also be beneficial to kind of cast our minds back to the those 10 days when it felt like Bernie actually had a shot, and kind of what we have been processing from the second failure of the Sanders campaign, and why he lost. And for me, an important takeaway, I think, is that people in this country don't want a better world and want a better life, but just don't believe it's possible. Don't believe when somebody says to them, we can make this happen. And so the work that we have to do, irrespective of who sits in the Oval Office, is to bring people into the experience of solidarity, into the experience of struggling together, so that they can begin to imagine that a different world is possible, as we like to say. We're a long way from actually bringing that world into reality, because we have to get people, we are still in the process of getting people to even believe that, maybe we have a shot at this. And so, I do think that I've seen that happen in all different kinds of fields of struggle, including in the anti-fascist struggle and the struggle against the right. So that will, I think, remain an important realm for us to be actively engaged in. But I think that, beyond any particular legislative demand or, electoral campaign, the task before us, like, it's corny, but like the task before us is to give people hope and like to enable people to have faith in themselves and each other, that like it doesn't have to be this way.
I just want to plug one thing that we are about to win in Portland DSA is universal preschool for our whole county. So this campaign really it started a few years ago after we started engaging in the budget cycle at the city level, and every year they're cutting the budget. They're cutting community centers where people send their kids, and making people have to beg at these budget forums to keep the things they need, and pitting people against each other. And we're like, okay, we're going to do a tax the rich campaign. We're going to do it with framing like the money is there, take it, give it back to us. We created this well. And so, in the process of that, we're like, okay, what do we want to fund? There are so many things that we need. And we eventually decided on universal preschool. So we have this ballot measure now, which has been created in coalition with lots of unions, teachers unions, the Parks Union, parents and preschool teachers. There was actually an organizing drive of preschool teachers that came out of this. It's going to be tuition-free preschool for all 3 and 4-year-olds in Multnomah County, with the workers, all preschool workers, teachers and assistants, having a minimum wage of $18 an hour, which is much higher than it is now, by taxing the city's wealthiest residents. So this is on the ballot in November. We had so many legal challenges leading up to this. Like, they did not want this on the ballot. There was another ballot measure being created in cooperation with KinderCare, which is like the largest private preschool company in the country. But we got 32,000 signatures in 4 weeks because of being active at the protests. And so they had no choice, and we ended up actually merging these 2 ballot measures because there was such a mandate for these demands. So, we're going to win it in November. And I think that this is what winning can look like for us, and especially with the question of like struggling alongside liberals. We brought in tons of parents and workers through this campaign because we're doing things that improve the material conditions of people's lives. And we've gotten, new members in DSA from this, and just like raising class consciousness around, we can take money back from the rich. That's our money. What else do we want to fund? What do we want to do next? I think, that's sort of our path forward here.
I can go. I kind of lost track of the questions a little bit, but I'll try. I think so. I have 2 thoughts in terms of kind of the path moving forward. One, all of the people who've kind of been engaged in this movement in this moment and will continue to be engaged, I think we really need to figure out how we have sustained engagement. How do we plug all of these individuals into local collectives, local organizations to really like continue to build power on the left? And then I think the second thing, learning from what happened after 2016, when we saw this huge influx of more people wanting to get engaged in organizing and political work. For newer folks coming in, I think it's really supporting the leadership of the people that have already been doing this work. This doesn't mean that like, hey, you listen to what we have to say. It's not that, but it's like not telling folks who live this on the day-to-day what to do, right? Like something simple. And that sustainability of like supporting people that are directly impacted and centering their experiences while continuing to grow our movements, right? Not just through like mobilizing, but deeper engagement, deeper political engagement, and like the cross-community relationship building that we really need amongst our different movements, amongst our different communities to really build solidarity, right? Like not just talk about solidarity as it often happens. At Drum, we break down solidarity in 4 different levels. The first being the symbolic solidarity of just like verbally expressing solidarity, or putting on a pin or a t-shirt. Then there's often what happens in kind of the nonprofit world of like the transactional solidarity. I'm going to come to your action, to your rally, you show up for mine, right? And then on the third level, the embodied solidarity of like individuals that are willing to put themselves in between a protester and a police officer making an arrest, or folks that are willing to chain themselves to an ICE bus, right? Willing to make sacrifices. And then on the last level is transformative solidarity, where masses of oppressed communities choose to or sacrifice something that they have in solidarity with another, right? Like, I think moving forward, like that 4th level really being what we need and what's going to provide us protection.
Thanks. I don't have a lot to add to that. Like Brendan, just to go back to the previous conversation, to say that a coup is not happening is not to say that voter suppression, electoral college victory with the minority vote is not possible. There still could be violence at poll sites and exploitation of that to grow the right, and that needs perfect. So the question, about balance with liberal groups and a bigger vision, I don't think it's so much a question of finding a balance between that. I think you need to do both. And there are times when you need different organizations to do both, right? There's a broader vision, a class consciousness, engaging people in struggle. All those things are different groups do that differently. But in fighting the right, anti-fascist work can't be limited to that politics. So we at YORF are very excited here in New York to see the DSA New York City anti-fascist working group being set up, but also think that it's not a matter. We certainly wouldn't want anyone to leave the working group that they're in to join that. That's not the best. But there are times when we need to involve all of DSA in this kind of work and not lead it to those groups. The next steps I think is labor involvement. And we've seen little bits of that, and Olivia talked about bits of that in Portland, and I just that's a longer struggle to get the massive union. I mean, that's happened in some of the anti-fascist and anti-racist coalitions in Europe against the British National Party and that kind of thing, and that's something we should. It's a harder slog here. We start with the smaller locals and everything, but I think that needs to be. If we're going to be strong enough to do this, then that's what you need to both be building up the labor movement for its own sake and also involving them in these kind of struggles as much as we can. Have a vision to do that.
I think that's a really good place to end. I want to thank our panelists so much for sharing so many inspiring and sharp thoughts. And thank you everyone for tuning in. And we hope that you'll join us for the next session in the series on continuing the political revolution, a roundtable on labor strategy, which will be tonight at 5 p.m. So have a great rest of the weekend, everybody, and goodbye.
Thank you so much.